everyone, and welcome to Planet Retail RNG's Global Retail Predictions for 2018 and beyond. My name is Doug Kuntz. I am a research director with Planet Retail RNG, and today what we're going to be doing is sharing with you some of the major global retail predictions that we expect this year, but honestly much beyond this year, and also some of the appropriate responses that we think retailers and brands and everyone in between needs to be working on so that they're well prepared for that retail future. And so to begin, I want to remind everyone, you've all, if you've seen us Planet Retail RNG before, you may be familiar with the STEEP framework. But effectively what the STEEP framework is it gives us a way to organize and look at the world and ultimately help predict what the future of retail is going to look like. So STEEP is an acronym, as you can see across the screen here. It stands for Society, Technology, Economy, Industry, and Policy. And society is obviously about kind of the consumer behavior and preferences that are changing. Technology can be a lot of the shiny objects, but also things as simple as internet penetration or mobile adoption. The economy is around how many people, how many consumers there are, and also how much money those shoppers have. The industry is about the competitive environment, and then the policy component is really about the disruption and wild cards that are hard to predict. And often that has to do with government, but it can be as things as random and uncontrollable as natural disasters, for example. But this is really the way Planet Retail RNG works and functions, and how we get to these retail predictions is really to look at boiling the ocean, if you will, and we organize all of these potential things that could impact the future of retail into these 5 big buckets, from how old is the population, what's the demographic or ethnic breakdown, to how much money is your shopper going to have, all the way to some of those shiny objects that I talked about, like drones and artificial intelligence. But the core of that is that there's dramatic disruption on the horizon. You know, we go through these cycles of fundamental retail change every couple decades, really, and we're obviously in the heart of one of those right now. And if I convey nothing else to you, it's that just continuing past trends is not going to be a good enough indication of what the future world is going to look like, because changing our business or the way we work by 1 or 2% every year and slowly course correcting is ultimately going to leave you behind the leaders in the industry. And so what I'll talk through today is some of those really big changes that are on the horizon, and what you can start thinking about as an industry leader to prepare and win in that. And so this is really how that process works, right? We start by looking at all of the things that we think could possibly impact the future, but that what it allows us to do is paint a picture of what that future scenario is going to look like. This is not just looking at data and saying, oh, people are going to be older, oh, people are going to be richer and poorer. What it allows us to do is visualize the competitive environment that we're going to be operating in. And ultimately, once we can visualize and once we can predict that future environment, we start to make the appropriate decisions and investments and build the capabilities that allow us to win in it. So this is not only a short-term, but a long-term planning process that many of the leading retailers and brands around the world that we work with are using, because there is this tectonic shift happening in the industry, and it's not going to be solved overnight. The choices and investments and decisions we make now are ultimately going to dictate success in 2020 and beyond. But certainly a lot of these things we can start doing in 2018. So as I go through this, I encourage you to think about some of these things, right? I'm going to share with you our vision of the future, or the scenario that we're planning for, but I encourage you to challenge some of that, think through what it means for your own business, and ask yourself, what should you be planning for and investing in today? And ultimately, what are some of the opportunities and some of the challenges that are presenting for your business, and how can you ultimately capitalize on those or limit those risks. So this is the process that we've gone through to get to some of these big statements and the predictions that I'm going to share with you. I'm not going to be able to share all of them with you in the time that we have today, but if you think about how this flowed from left to right, we started with, here's a selection of some of the drivers of change, that STEEP framework that I talked about. Here's some of those that we looked at. This is not an exhaustive list. We looked at literally hundreds of different data, more than others across these 5 areas, but it led us to some really big statements about what the future retail landscape is going to look like. And so this is that scenario that we're starting to plan for, right? And there's 9 big statements here that I'm going to share, and I've broken it down into 3 sections or 3 groupings. And the first one of those is around the consumer and how the consumer is changing, what consumer behavior and preferences will look like in the future, and ultimately how we need to respond to that. And I'll share with you in just a moment a couple details of that. The second one, the second grouping here in this future scenario, is the industry itself and how that is reshaping. So a popular one here is about how channels are beginning to blur. And some of the customers that we're starting to work with are actually reconsidering channel strategy altogether, because they're starting to think that maybe that's not the most effective way to segment and go to market anymore. And so not only are channels changing, but the e-commerce has, of course, introduced this idea of borderless retail, which will continue to grow. And I'll share with you a vision of that in just a moment here. And retailer and brand roles are really changing because of the dramatic disruption that we're seeing. These organizations are having to really redefine some of the capabilities and the strengths that they have and that they've relied on for decades to fuel much of their growth. And so the third part of this scenario is really around how those organizations and businesses are changing themselves. And so there's great fragmentation and disruption on the horizon for the supply chain. Most of you are probably already feeling that. The store is going to have to evolve, and I'll show you an example of what we think that looks like. And then ecosystems, this idea of digital ecosystems that's become much more popular in the industry as of late, will really start to flex their muscle more than they already have. That's the retailers like Amazon, Alibaba, JD.com, and some of the store-based players that are also building ecosystems themselves. And so when you add all of this up, you start to have a really different operating environment than our businesses are currently set up to win in. And honestly, there's a big transition, a big evolution that's going to happen in most retail and CPG and supplier and manufacturer businesses. And the winners are probably going to be dictated by those that can make that change the smoothest and the quickest, because the pace of change is not going to slow down. And the disruption is really going to create some really clear winners and losers in the marketplace. And we've already seen that in many markets as well. So this is the scenario that we think we're heading towards at a really high level. And so what I'll do now is share with you some of the examples of some of these specific points and what that might mean for your business. So I'll start with the consumer or the shopper, and that first statement we had on the last screen was every shopper is unique. Now, this may not seem particularly novel to you, but it's actually a big change in how many businesses work. So there's obviously growing differences in wealth, in age, in ethnicity, even in location, think issues like urban versus rural. All of these issues will become so much more visible in many markets around the world. If you operate in most of the developed world currently, you can already attest to these shifts. This is happening really quickly and places like China that are developing really quickly, and these distinctions are emerging faster than most can keep up with. But the important element here is that it requires retailers and brands to engage with shoppers in a much more individualized, personalized way. Most of our businesses historically were set up to what we call market down the middle, sort of this mass middle class, typically consumer market that behaves in generally pretty consistent and similar ways. And now this world that we operate in, some of it facilitated by technology, but a lot of it just a result of natural demographic shifts and socioeconomic shifts. All of these questions around this shopper are going to become much more important about not only what I buy and how much money I have and what I need, but also my decision criteria, what I'm influenced by, where I'm located, and my consumer identity. All of these things need to become much more top of mind for brands and retailers as they rethink their offering and communication strategy. And so what does that really look like? Well, consumers are more demanding than ever before because they had access to a lot of this personalization enabled by digital technology. Everyone can pull out their smartphone and get information at the tip of their fingers at a moment's notice. Things are becoming much more convenient and flexible for consumers. And so it's really reshaping shopper expectations. We call it the on-demand consumer. And it's really focused on on convenience, on flexibility, on immediacy, on personalization. Frictionless is another popular word you hear. But really what demand that places on retailers and brands is to be much more targeted and much more relevant to the shopper to deserve winning the purchase. The reality is that consumers know that the industry knows a lot about them. And so if they're freely or not freely giving up a lot of this information about themselves and can access a lot of these things in other parts of their life, like media, for example, well, in retail, this is becoming an expectation that, and the retailers and brands that can provide and win in this space are really going to see positive results relative to those who can't. So I want to reset for a moment and just explain how dramatically our industry is reshaping. And this is going to touch on not only the supply chain, but also just the way the value chain and the path to purchase is evolving. So if you think about the traditional retail path to purchase, you started on the left side there as a brand, you manufacture some product, one way or another, you get it onto trucks, you ship it off to either a distribution center or directly to stores, or sometimes an intermediary wholesaler that handles getting these products to stores. And then the shopper shows up at the store, they pick the items off the shelf, they pack up those items, they go through the checkout themselves, and they drive them home. And this is a really traditional route to market, but what it enabled was a streamlined supply chain. And there's a lot of scale and efficiency that came with that. Well, what's happening in today's world is that e-commerce is starting to disintermediate a lot of this traditional value chain. So not only the consumer can come to the store, but suddenly now they can get stuff delivered to their homes. They can get stuff delivered from various points along this supply chain, and it's fragmenting our existing operating processes and creating a lot of pressure on supply chains and on profitability. Then you start to layer in more sophisticated brand direct models that you're bypassing a retailer altogether and going directly to a shopper's home in some way. And then the really complex part of this, now we've already set up a much more fragmented and disintermediated value chain here. But the really complex part of this is once you start to layer in what we call digital intermediaries, and I'll show you an example of that in just a minute, but digital intermediaries sit between the consumer and the end purchase. They don't actually buy or sell products, but they have a really big influence and impact on what shoppers buy, where they buy, how they buy, what we call aggregating demand. So a really good example of this, the famous examples are typically things like Google, like Facebook. Search engines are very common in this regard. But there's all of these new consumer influences and touch points that you as a brand or you as a retailer no longer have control over in most cases. And it's making for a much more difficult uh, purchase journey because it's harder and harder to influence the shopper and catch them at those moments of truth. In many cases, what you see across the screen here owns those moments instead. And so these intermediaries are becoming new marketing platforms that are reshaping how retailers and brands have to engage with their consumers. You think of if you're a beauty or a personal care manufacturer or a retailer for that matter, YouTube is a huge influencer on how and what consumers buy, because you can go on to YouTube and you can see people reviewing cosmetics, you can see people providing tutorials on how to properly apply some of these things. Oftentimes, these are coming with specific product recommendations. Well, that's going to continue to get more and more common across categories and across the path to purchase in all of these different ways. And so making sure that these elements are a core part of your strategy, or at least factored into your strategy, is going to be so essential to success, because otherwise what you're going to see is the shopper really bypassing most of your traditional touch points altogether in favor of some of these other tools that typically have more users, can often be much more social, much more seamless and frictionless, and ultimately really disrupt how you operate and engage with your shoppers. I talked about how that value chain is changing, but I wanted to illustrate what a big impact this does have on the supply chain of the future. So what you see across your screen here is we've broken the sort of path to purchase into 4 big elements: how a consumer orders, how that's fulfilled, how that order is fulfilled, how that order is ultimately delivered, the actual shipping of it in some way, and then ultimately how the consumer receives that item. And you don't have to read everything across the screen to realize that there are lots of options. Well, if you add up or multiply, excuse me, all of the options, the 5 different ways you can order, the 8 different ways you can fulfill, 7 different ways you can deliver, and 9 different ways you can receive products, you get to more than 2,500 options. 2,500 different ways a product can be ordered and ultimately get to the end consumer. Well, not every retailer, not every brand is going to have to support all 2,500 of those options. But an interesting process that a lot of our customers are doing is really thinking their fulfillment, or their supply chain map and how that's changing. So if you're a brand, if you map your biggest customers against these things, you're going to find a lot of different permutations, and a lot of those differences are not going to be consistent between your different customers. And so the supply chain complexity and agility and inventory visibility that both retailers and brands are going to need in this future world we've barely touched the surface of that. And so I encourage everyone, if you're not already thinking of this, start to get those supply chain people in these critical conversations, because supply chain is going to be one of the key criteria that will enable or differentiate the winners and losers of the future. So I mentioned e-commerce at the top of this webinar, and I also dove a little deeper into ecosystems, but I wanted to show you what that really means, what that looks like in today's world. At the core of a digital ecosystem traditionally is a retail platform. So let's use Amazon as an example. The Amazon.com website sits at the heart of Amazon's digital ecosystem. But what they've done is layered all these things around that that are complementary. Sometimes they're kind of added on to the core retail platform itself. But what they've really done is created more and more ways and more incentive for you to be part of that Amazon ecosystem. And so if you look at Amazon in particular, you obviously have the commerce platforms themselves. You have some of the Prime is obviously a key component of this. So 2-day shipping, what comes in big cities around the world, 2-hour, 1-hour, same-day shipping. What comes with Prime is access to music, access to video. You have access to all these other services associated with the Amazon ecosystem. You know, all of these things make it harder and harder for a shopper to leave the Amazon world. It creates more opportunities to engage and influence across all of these different touch points. And it creates all these opportunities to collect data and insight on the shoppers so that their future product offerings, their future targeting, their future communication can get even stronger. Well, not everyone on earth is going to be able to build an ecosystem as extensively as this. I could show you an example for Alibaba that's actually more advanced than this, JD.com, that looks really similar to this. Even Walmart has built up a pretty impressive digital ecosystem. But there's not that many other retailers around the world that can really match this. And so what I want to illustrate for everyone is that ecosystems are going to become so much more visible to people in 2018 and beyond. You've already seen the tremendous growth that Amazon, Alibaba, and others around the world have had, and a lot of it's fueled by this. But the customer understanding, the continuing and growing scale, all of these different touch points that don't even necessarily affect retail are only going to continue to expand and continue to deepen. And so our opportunities as retail competitors and as brands to find more influence, ownable influence points, ownable engagement points is declining. I encourage everyone to think about that as they think about their consumer path to purchase, because this is what the Amazon consumer journey looks like. And there's lots of lines and circles and bubbles here going around. The important part to convey here is you can't really even tell when one purchase starts and another ends. As I'm browsing Amazon and then I go listen to Amazon Music or watch a movie, well, all of this information is informing Amazon more about my behavior. It's impacting, it gives them more opportunities to target purchases that may be products that I didn't buy but looked at. Gives them ways to kind of bucket me into a consumer profile that might allow them to market or communicate to me in a certain way. The world of path to purchase is evolving so quickly, and most of our businesses are not set up to win in that environment. So the key here is, how do you find engagement points in this journey, and how do you create new engagement points to influence your shopper outside of the Amazon ecosystem, outside of the Walmart ecosystem? Stores are going to be emptied and overhauled in our view. A lot of items that we consider auto replenishment items, things like paper towels, diapers, a lot of consumables that you can sort of bank on consuming every week or every month. More of that is going to move online. More of that is going to leave the store. And so what's going to happen is we're going to really have to rethink what the role of the store of the future really plays, because this is going to happen differently across categories. What you're seeing here is some projections for a generic US store. It's not specific to one retailer. You'd change some of this data depending on what channel you operate in, what consumers you win with, what markets you operate in. But the important part is that the way our business is set up to serve stores is going to have to change, because as more stuff moves online, the store is becoming one of many touch points or engagement points for the end consumer. To get a shopper into the store, we need to create much more compelling reasons to justify that trip. And so you start to see we have a store of the future framework that I'm not going to get into today, but subscribers can hear more about that following this. The store of the future is much more focused on experience, and that's probably not a surprise to people, but it becomes much more frictionless. It becomes much more a curated selection of merchandise. Services play a larger role in the store of the future. But ultimately, for brands, it means there's going to be a huge rethinking of the assortment and the brand portfolio inside of stores. It's going to require a huge rethinking of even what brands try to accomplish inside these stores, and ultimately accepting that the store's role is changing. And how do we start to measure ROI, or how do we evaluate success when it's just one part of a larger picture? We're going to have to increasingly break down the walls between online and store-based, and look at it more holistically and collectively, because treating these two things as competitors in the future world is not going to work. So to reset, this is the world we're used to coming from. The shopper goes to the store, the shopper picks up an item. It's pretty straightforward. Our supply chains, our KPIs as buyers and sellers, our systems, our technology, all of these things are set up to serve this world. But this is the world we're headed towards, where there's this fluid, shopper-controlled world where it's hard to even begin to see the perfectly clear purchase journey. And so you hear words like omni-channel, you hear words like seamless and frictionless. Digital e-commerce plays a huge role in here. Digital intermediaries that I already talked about are a big component of this map. But ultimately, it's leading to a world where shoppers can get what they want, when they want it, how they want it. And most of our businesses around the world aren't set up to serve that world. We think there's four strategies that ultimately, four focus areas that are going to dictate future success. Obviously, the store of the future and how that's reinvented is going to play a huge role here. But it's about how the store interacts with e-commerce and with those digital ecosystems that I talked about. How are other retailers and brands going to start building digital ecosystems of their own, even if they're less extensive than Amazon? And how does e-commerce in the store impact how our supply chain and fulfillment capabilities need to evolve? And ultimately, how all of these things will have to interact with the new ways we have to engage and retain our shoppers. Because how these four things play together is what's going to dictate future success. It's not just changing the store or just selling more effectively online, because if you do one of those things, but the supply chain doesn't come with it, or fulfillment capabilities don't come with it, or the way we interact with our shoppers doesn't come with it, well, we're probably not going to be a leader in the industry, because the leaders, the winners, are going to be able to marry all of these things in a much more seamless and effective way. And ultimately, they'll sell more, but it'll also help them manage their costs much better than most in the industry can currently do. Now, you don't have to do this necessarily alone. I think retailer and brand partnerships are going to be so much more important in the future, because retailers and brands are going to start to play off of their strengths, and these strategic collaborations are going to be able to leverage strengths of various businesses for mutual success. If everyone tries to do this alone, we're just going to get overtaken by Alibaba and Walmart and Amazon and a few other players. And so I encourage everyone to really open their minds about where their strategies in these four places are going, and also where identifying potential partnerships that could advance some of these strategies as well. And so I'm going to wrap up with that, because we're at the end of our time here. But I did want to encourage everyone, for the people that aren't familiar with Planet Retail RNG, Everything you saw here, the report that this is based on for our future retail outlook and future steep trends is available to subscribers on the website. Um, almost all of the underlying data that underpins these forecasts is available to subscribers on the website. And diving deeper into those four subjects about e-commerce, about store of the future, changing fulfillment and supply chain, and obviously also shopper engagement and retention, you can find much more research and insight on those things for subscribers as well. If you don't know how to get to those, or you want to learn more, you can see the contact information on your screen here. Please feel free to reach out to info@planetretail.net. You could also reach out directly to your account manager if you're aware of who that is. My name again is Doug Kuntz, and you see my contact information there. With that, I'll leave you for the rest of the day and encourage you all to focus, hone in, make the intentional choices around those four key strategies that we think will ultimately dictate the winners and losers. And Planet Retail RNG is a business here standing by to help you navigate that landscape. Thanks. Have a great day.